The man at table 7, Gideon Price, was worth more than the entire city block, and he treated the world like he owned it. To him, the waitress was just part of the furniture, a nameless, faceless servant he barely registered. He saw her simple uniform and tired eyes, and assumed she was uneducated, another soul trapped in a dead-end job. He was about to close the biggest deal of his life with investors from across the globe. But when his high-paid translator faltered, and the billion-dollar deal began to crumble before his very eyes, it was the invisible waitress who stepped out of the shadows. And with 7 perfect languages, she didn't just save his deal. She dismantled his entire world. The clinking of silver on porcelain was the baseline rhythm of Gideon Price's life. It was the sound of power, the ambient noise of deals being struck in hushed tones over $500 stakes. Tonight that sound was emanating from Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive its name was only whispered among the city's elite. Gideon sat at his usual corner table, a throne of plush leather from which he surveyed his kingdom of finance and influence. His suit was a custom Tom Ford, his watch a Patek Philippe that cost more than the average American house, and his patience was, as always, razor-thin. He was waiting for his associates, but his gaze kept snagging on one of the waitstaff. Her name tag, he squinted to see, read, Anna. She moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving. There was no wasted energy, no shuffling feet or hesitant gestures. While other waiters flitted about with a nervous energy, she glided through the controlled chaos with a serene, almost detached grace. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face, though pretty in a classical sort of way, was devoid of makeup and expression. To Gideon she was a specimen of quiet desperation. He'd seen 1,000 like her. Women who probably peaked in high school, maybe took a semester at a community college before life got in the way, and were now resigned to a life of fetching things for men like him. He mentally calculated her hourly wage, added a generous tip percentage, and scoffed internally. A week of her earnings wouldn't even cover the bottle of Chateau Margaux he was about to order. He dismissed her from his thoughts as easily as he would a fly. Anna Kovacs felt Gideon Price's eyes on her, but she gave no sign. She had long ago perfected the art of being invisible. It was a survival mechanism. In a place like Aurelia, you were either a predator or prey, and the only way to avoid being either was to become part of the landscape. She knew who he was, of course. Anyone who followed the pulse of the city knew of Gideon Price, the tech titan whose company, Price Dynamics, had devoured competitors with the brutal efficiency of a shark. She'd read about him not in gossip columns, but in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. She knew the names of his board members, the value of his stock, and the ruthless strategies he'd employed to build his empire. She knew, for instance, that his seemingly effortless success was built on a foundation of leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers that had left a trail of shattered companies and ruined lives. He was a creator of wealth, yes, but also a destroyer of legacies. As she refilled his water glass, her movements fluid and silent, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She saw in his gaze a casual, dismissive arrogance. He saw nothing in hers at all. That's how she wanted it. Her boss, a perpetually stressed man named Gerard, valued her for her unflappability. "Anna, you're a rock," he'd often say. "You handle the sharks better than anyone." He had no idea how true that was. Gerard didn't know that she could mentally calculate currency conversions faster than his accounting software, or that she read geopolitical analysis for fun. He didn't know that the slight accent she carefully suppressed was not from one country, but was the ghost of several. To him, she was just his most reliable waitress. Gideon's guests arrived, 2 junior executives, both jittery and eager to please. Mr. Price traffic was a nightmare. One of them, a young man named Peterson, stammered. Gideon didn't look up from his phone. "Anticipate nightmares, Peterson. That's what I pay you for." The man flinched as if struck. Anna, standing by a service station nearby, felt a familiar pang of something cold and hard in her chest. It was the same brand of casual cruelty she had seen fell men far greater than Peterson. She remembered her father, a proud, brilliant man, reduced to a shell by the machinations of men like Gideon Price. She pushed the memory down, locking it away in the vault where she kept her past. Emotions were a liability she could not afford. "The prospectus for the Tokyo merger is on your tablet," the other executive Kent offered meekly. "I've read it," Gideon clipped, finally pocketing his phone. "It's sloppy. The risk assessment for the yen's fluctuation is amateurish. Fix it." He flagged Anna down with an impatient flick of his fingers. "We'll have the prestige menu, and a bottle of the 96 Margot." "An excellent choice, sir," Anna said, her voice a placid monotone. She didn't look at him, her focus entirely on her notepad. She could feel his stare, analyzing her, categorizing her, and finding her wanting. It was a sensation she had grown used to, a cloak of underestimation that had become her most effective armor. For the next hour she served them with impeccable precision. She presented the wine, decanted it with a surgeon's steady hand, and poured it without spilling a single drop. She described each course of the elaborate tasting menu with a detached professionalism that betrayed no hint of the complex thoughts swirling in her mind. She listened as Gideon alternately berated and ignored his underlings, dissecting their work, their ambition, and their very character. He was sharpening his teeth on them, and they were letting him. As she cleared their dessert plates, she heard Peterson say, "Sir, about the multinational summit next week. About the translators." Gideon waved a dismissive hand. "The agency is handling it. I need flawless communication. This deal with the consortium is everything. We're talking Japanese manufacturing, German engineering, and Saudi capital. There is zero room for error." "Of course, sir," Kent chimed in. "It's just, the cultural nuances are so specific. Madame Dubois is notoriously particular about formalities, and Sheikh Al-Hamad. I am not paying a team of translators to be mystified by cultural nuances," Gideon interrupted, his voice laced with steel. "I'm paying them to be invisible conduits of my will. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mr. Price." Anna retreated to the kitchen, the words echoing in her ears. Invisible conduits of my will. That's what he thought of people. Tools, instruments. She took a deep breath, the heat and clamor of the kitchen, a stark contrast to the cold, rarefied air of the dining room. She placed the dirty dishes in the rack, her movements methodical. She was a conduit, all right. But she had a will of her own, and deep within her, buried under years of forced humility, it was beginning to stir. The summit he spoke of was in 3 days, and Anna had a feeling it was going to be a day of reckoning. The private dining room at Price Dynamics headquarters was a monument to corporate power. A single slab of polished obsidian served as the table, reflecting the panoramic view of the New York skyline. The air was thick with tension and the subtle competing sense of expensive cologne. At the head of the table sat Gideon Price, looking every bit the modern emperor. Arranged around him were the figures who would decide the fate of his next great venture. There was Mr. Kenji Tanaka from Tokyo, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a mind of legendary sharpness. Beside him sat Herr Wolfgang Schmidt, the stout, no-nonsense head of a German engineering firm and his legal counsel. Across from them was Madame Geneviève Dubois, a Parisian investor whose elegance was matched only by her ferocious negotiating style. And finally, there was Sheikh Khalid Al-Hamad, a Saudi financier whose delegation communicated almost exclusively in Arabic. The deal was a complex, multi-billion-dollar partnership to create a new global logistics network. It was Gideon's magnum opus, and it was already falling apart. The problem was the translation. The lead translator, a man named Jeffrey, hired from a top-tier agency, was sweating through his suit. He'd stumbled over a technical term in German, earning a scowl from Herr Schmidt. His attempt at Japanese honorifics had been clumsy, causing a barely perceptible tightening around Mr. Tanaka's eyes. "Mr. Price," Madame Dubois said, her French crisp and cutting, "your proposal mentions dynamic asset allocation, but your translator's rendering of this into French suggests, let's call it, fickle financial gambling. I trust this is not your intention." Gideon's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle pulsed in his cheek. "Jeffrey," he said, his voice dangerously low, "clarify." Jeffrey paled. "My apologies, madame. What Mr. Price means is a responsive, a fluid methodology for capital." He was flailing. The French interpreter on Madame Dubois' team simply shook her head with a look of pity. The deal hinged on precision, on trust, and every mistranslated word was a crack in the foundation. The German delegation began a heated side conversation, their words a torrent of guttural consonants that Jeffrey couldn't even begin to intercept. Sheikh al-Hamad's advisor leaned in and murmured something in Arabic, and the Sheikh's benevolent expression hardened into a mask of deep skepticism. Gideon felt a primal rage building in his gut. He was being made to look like a fool. He was losing control. His entire empire was built on control. At that moment, the door opened silently. A team of caterers from Aurelia, which had been contracted for the event, began serving coffee and refreshments, and leading them was Anna Kovac. Gideon barely registered her. She was just another part of the background, another uniform. He was too consumed by the disaster unfolding at his table. Herr Schmidt, frustrated, finally slammed his palm on the table. He spoke in rapid, angry German, declaring the situation unacceptable and questioning how they could be trusted with execution if they couldn't even handle translation. Jeffrey looked at Gideon with panicked eyes. He's upset about the technical aspects, sir." This was the final straw. But before Gideon could erupt, a calm, clear voice cut through the tension. "He says the technical specifications are the core of the agreement," the voice said in perfect, unaccented German before switching to English. "And if your team cannot communicate them with precision, he doubts your company's ability to execute such a complex project." A stunned silence fell over the room. Every head turned towards the source of the voice. It was Anna. She stood by the coffee service, a silver pot still in her hand, her expression as placid as ever. Herr Schmidt stared at her, his bushy eyebrows raised in astonishment. He responded in German, a complex question about proprietary gear ratios in their proposed engine design. Without missing a beat, Anna replied in German, her vocabulary technical and precise. Then she turned her head slightly. "Herr Schmidt is asking for clarification on the torque-to-weight ratio specified in Appendix C, page 12. She translated for Gideon, her English crisp and clear. He believes the figures may not account for stress under Arctic conditions, a potential market for the new fleet." Gideon was speechless. His brain was struggling to process what was happening. The waitress, the quiet, invisible waitress, was fluently debating German engineering specifications. Before anyone could recover, Madame Dubois, intrigued, decided to test her, asking in French about the American style of governance in the proposal and how it would integrate with European oversight. Anna met her gaze directly, translating the question flawlessly before replying to Madame Dubois in perfect French, suggesting a joint oversight committee with equal veto power on regulatory matters. Madame Dubois' perfectly painted lips curved into a slow, genuine smile. She nodded, impressed. A sensible suggestion. Now Mr. Tanaka, who had been watching the entire exchange with hawk-like intensity, spoke. His Japanese was formal, layered with politeness that masked a razor-sharp inquiry about supply chain vulnerabilities. Anna turned to him, bowed her head slightly in a gesture of perfect respect, and replied in fluent Japanese. She explained the redundant systems and mitigation strategies outlined in the latter half of the prospectus pages he clearly hadn't been guided to by the incompetent Jeffrey. She then translated the exchange for the table. Finally, Sheikh Al-Hamad spoke a long, flowing stream of Arabic directed at his advisor, but clearly intended for the room. Anna listened patiently. When he was finished, she turned to Gideon. The Sheikh notes that while the financial projections are robust, the proposal lacks a framework for a charitable endowment or trust, she explained. He suggests that dedicating a small percentage of profits to a trust focused on education and infrastructure in the regions served by the new network would not only be a gesture of goodwill, but would also create long-term stability and community buy-in. The room was utterly silent, save for the hum of the city outside the window. Jeffrey, the translator, looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Gideon Price's executives, Peterson and Kent, were staring with their mouths agape. The foreign delegations were no longer looking at Gideon. They were all looking at the waitress. In the space of 5 minutes, she had not only translated 7 languages, German, English, French, Japanese, and Arabic, along with the whispered Spanish and Russian from side conversations she'd also caught. But she had also demonstrated a deep understanding of engineering, corporate governance, supply chain logistics, and Islamic finance. She hadn't just been a conduit. She had been a strategist. Breaking the spell, she placed the last coffee cup on the table, picked up her empty tray, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Price?" she asked, her voice once again, the quiet, professional monotone of a servant. Gideon couldn't find his voice. He just stared at her, his world tilted on its axis. The woman he had dismissed as an uneducated nobody, a piece of the furniture, had just single-handedly saved the most important deal of his career. And she had done it without breaking a sweat, without a single note, without a moment's hesitation. He had thought he was the shark in this room. He was wrong. He had been swimming alongside a leviathan and hadn't even known it. The immediate aftermath was a blur of conciliation and renewed enthusiasm. The tension in the room had evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of excitement. Deals that had been on the verge of collapse were now being discussed with vigor, all facilitated by the quiet woman who had materialized from the background. Gideon, regaining some semblance of composure, asked her to stay. He dismissed the disgraced Jeffrey with a flick of his wrist. "Your name," he said to her, his voice hoarse. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. "Anna Kovacs," she replied, her gaze level. "Stay," he repeated. "Translate. I'll pay you 10 times what the agency charged for him." "My duties with the catering service are finished, sir. If you'll excuse me," she said politely, turning to leave. "Wait." The command was sharper this time, laced with his old authority, but it felt hollow now. "That's not a request. I need you." Anna paused at the door. "I am not for hire, Mr. Price." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a room full of powerful people and one utterly dumbfounded billionaire. Gideon's mind raced. It was impossible. No one walked away from him. No one turned down that kind of money. Who was she? The mystery of her was more compelling than any business deal. The woman was a walking contradiction, a waitress's uniform with a diplomat's mind, a servant's posture with a scholar's intellect. The rest of the day was spent closing the preliminary agreements. The foreign delegations were more than cooperative, often directing their questions through Gideon to the memory of the woman who had understood them so perfectly. The deal was saved, but Gideon's victory felt strangely empty. He had won, but he had been a spectator in his own triumph. The moment the last executive left, Gideon buzzed his intercom. "Frank, my office. Now." Frank Miller was the head of Gideon's personal security, a former FBI agent with a bulldog's tenacity and an unwavering loyalty that Gideon paid a fortune to maintain. He was a man who found things. "Sir," Frank said, entering the office. He was a broad, grey-haired man who moved with a quiet purposefulness. "I need you to find someone," Gideon said, pacing in front of the window. "Not find them physically. I need to know who they are. Everything about them." He gave Frank the name Anna Kovacs. He described the events of the day, his voice a mixture of awe and frustration. "She speaks at least 7 languages. She understands engineering schematics and international finance law, and she works as a waitress at Aurelia. None of this makes sense. Dig. I want to know where she was born, where she went to school, what she had for breakfast. I want to know why she's hiding in plain sight." "Understood, sir." Frank said, his expression unreadable. The search began, and for the first time in his long career, Frank Miller hit a brick wall. The name Anna Kovacs yielded next to nothing. She had a social security number, issued 5 years prior. She had a rental history in a modest, nondescript apartment building in Queens. She paid her bills on time in cash. She had no credit cards, no driver's license, no social media footprint. Her employment record started and ended with Aurelia. Before that, according to the digital records of the United States, Anna Kovacs did not exist. "She's a ghost," Frank reported to Gideon 2 days later. "The profile is clean, too clean. It's the kind of sterile identity someone creates when they're running from something. Witness protection, maybe? Or something less official. A ghost who speaks 7 languages," Gideon mused, staring out at the city. The puzzle was consuming him. No, not a ghost. Someone who wants to be one. "Keep digging, Frank. Look for immigration records name changes. Check international databases. Someone with that level of education must have left a trace somewhere. A university, a fellowship." Frank nodded. "I've already started cross-referencing linguistic prodigies and academic records from top European universities, going back a decade. It's a needle in a haystack. Find the needle, Frank." While Frank hunted through the digital ether, Gideon found himself unable to stay away. The next evening he went to Aurelia not for a meeting but alone. He sat at a small table in a less conspicuous section and watched her. She was exactly as she had been before, poised, efficient, invisible. She took his order without a flicker of recognition, her professionalism a perfect, impenetrable shield. "The deal was a success," he said, trying to breach the wall. "Thanks to you." "I'm glad it was a satisfactory outcome, sir," she replied, her voice neutral. "Will you be having wine this evening?" It was maddening. He was Gideon Price. People fell over themselves to be in his orbit. But this woman treated him with the polite indifference she would afford any other customer. He felt an unfamiliar sensation. Helplessness. A week later, Frank walked into his office, a single manila folder in his hand. He looked grim. "You found something," Gideon said, sitting up straight. "A needle," Frank confirmed, placing the folder on the obsidian desk. It was buried deep. Interpol archives cross-referenced with sealed academic records from the University of Oxford. Gideon opened the folder. Inside was a photograph of a younger woman, her face brighter, more open, but unmistakably the same person. Her name, however, was different. Anastasia Kovacs. Beneath the photo was a summary. Daughter of Dmitry Kovac, the CEO of Kovac Capital, a once mighty European investment bank. Anastasia had been a star student at Oxford, enrolled in a prestigious program for philosophy, politics, and economics, with a focus on modern languages. She was reportedly fluent in 8 languages by the age of 20. Then, 6 years ago, she had vanished. She dropped out of university, her record sealed, and all public traces of her ceased to exist. The folder also contained a timeline, and this was the part that made the blood drain from Gideon's face. 6 years ago, Anastasia Kovac disappeared from Oxford. And what happened 6 years ago, Gideon didn't need to read the file to know. He remembered it clearly. It was one of his first major, aggressive acquisitions. Price Dynamics, then a rising predator in the market, had initiated a hostile takeover of a struggling European rival. To secure the leverage needed for the takeover, they had targeted and systematically dismantled the rival's primary lender. The lender was Kovac Capital. He remembered the press releases, the ruthless market, plays, the short selling that had crippled the bank's stock. To him, it had been a brilliant textbook maneuver, a masterstroke of corporate warfare. He had never once considered the people behind the name. Dmitry Kovac, the CEO, had been ruined. The bank collapsed, taking the family's fortune and reputation with it. News reports at the time mentioned his death from a sudden heart attack just months later, widely attributed to the stress and disgrace. Gideon leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. The room felt cold. The ghost in his system wasn't a random mystery. She was a consequence. The uneducated waitress he had looked down upon was the heiress to an empire he had personally helped annihilate. Her poverty, her uniform, her life of quiet servitude. It wasn't a matter of chance. It was a direct result of his ambition. He looked at the photo of the smiling young woman at Oxford, then thought of the guarded, expressionless woman at Aurelia. He had done that. He had extinguished that light. A new detail in the file caught his eye. A key figure in the takeover, a man on the inside of Kovac Capital, who had allegedly fed crucial information to Price Dynamics' acquisition team, was a rising star in the bank's London office. A man who had been rewarded handsomely for his betrayal with a senior position at another firm, before years later finding his way to a seat on the board of Price Dynamics. His name was Robert Munro. The very same Robert Munro who was now Gideon's trusted board member, the man who had been so vocally supportive of Gideon's ruthless tactics back then. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. Anna wasn't just hiding from the world. She was hiding from a past that he had created, and now a man who had betrayed her family was sitting on his own board of directors. The Leviathan he had discovered wasn't just swimming alongside him. He had been swimming in the wreckage of her life all along. The knowledge festered in Gideon like a poison. Every skyscraper he saw seemed to mock him, a testament to an empire built on the rubble of others. The casual cruelty he'd always seen as a necessary tool of leadership now felt like a vulgar stain on his character. He, Gideon Price, the master of the universe, had been nothing more than a blunt instrument in a tragedy he hadn't even bothered to notice. He knew he couldn't approach her at the restaurant again. This was not a conversation to be had over a linen tablecloth. He had Frank find her address the drab walk-up building in Queens he had previously dismissed. One evening after the dinner rush, he drove himself there, his usual chauffeured Maybach left in the garage. He felt a need to approach this on foot, as a man, not as a symbol. The building's hallway smelled of stale cooking and disinfectant. It was a world away from the rarefied air he was used to. He climbed 4 flights of stairs and knocked on the door of apartment 4B. It opened a few moments later. Anna stood there still in her black and white uniform, looking exhausted. When she saw him, her face didn't register surprise, but a deep, weary resignation. It was as if she had been expecting this moment for years. "Mr. Price," she said, her voice flat. "This is highly inappropriate." "I know," he said, his own voice sounding foreign to him, stripped of its usual confidence. "May I come in?" "Please." She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Whatever she saw there, guilt, uncertainty, a crack in the marble facade, made her step aside. Her apartment was small, sparse, but immaculately clean. Books were its only decoration, stacked high on every available surface. They were in Russian, German, Chinese, Arabic. A well-worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations lay on a small, scarred coffee table. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets. It was the transient space of someone who was prepared to leave at a moment's notice. On a small table near the window sat a vase with a single, fresh, white orchid, a small, defiant touch of elegance in the stark room. "I know who you are," he began, standing awkwardly in the center of the room. "Anastasia." The name hung in the air between them. She visibly flinched, a flicker of pain crossing her features before the mask of neutrality slammed back into place. "That person doesn't exist anymore," she said, quietly, turning to face him fully. "You of all people should know that." The accusation was soft-spoken, but it hit him like a physical blow. I didn't know," he stammered, "about you, your father. To me, Kovac Capital was just a name on a balance sheet, a target. It was business." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "A balance sheet. That's what my father's life's work was to you, his legacy. He admired you, you know, before the end. He said you were a barbarian, but a brilliant one. He thought business was a game of strategy, of intellect. He didn't realize he was in a back-alley knife fight with a man who owned the alley." She walked to the window, her back to him, her silhouette framed against the distant, glittering lights of Manhattan. His world. He lost everything. She continued, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly. Our home, his reputation. His friends turned their backs on him. The heart attack they listed on his death certificate was just a formality. He died of shame. My mother. She faded. I had to drop out of my studies to care for her. When she passed, there was nothing left. The name Kovac was poison. So I buried it. I buried Anastasia. I learned to be invisible. I learned to survive. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Gideon's pride. He had seen the world in terms of winners and losers. He had never stayed to count the bodies of the losing side. I am sorry, he said. The words felt pathetic, inadequate. Saying sorry doesn't change anything, I know that. But I am. Profoundly. She turned from the window. Why are you here, Mr. Price, to ease your conscience, to offer me blood money to make yourself feel better? No, he said, shaking his head. I'm here because of Robert Monroe. At the mention of the name, a new emotion crossed Anna's face, a flash of pure, cold hatred that was more terrifying than any outburst. I know he worked for your father, Gideon said, pressing on. And I know he was instrumental in the takeover. He fed us information, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. He betrayed your father to get ahead. I've always known someone on the inside helped you, she whispered, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Monroe. He was my father's protégé. He used to come to our house for dinner. He's on my board now, Gideon said, and I believe he's trying to do to me what he helped me do to your father. Small bits of sabotage leaks to the press about the new consortium deal. He's trying to undermine it. To undermine me. Anna stared at him, her sharp mind piecing it all together. The snake eats its own tail, how poetic. "I need your help," Gideon said, finally getting to the point, not as a translator, as a partner. "You know the world these deals are made in. You know the European players better than I do. You understand the culture, the language of finance, in a way my people don't. Monroe used your family's legacy to climb his way into my company. Help me expose him. Help me protect what we just built." Anna let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You want me to help you? You, the man who destroyed my life, want me to help you save your empire from the jackal you unleashed? I'm not asking you to save my empire," Gideon said, his voice raw with a sincerity he hadn't felt in years. "I'm asking you to help me get justice for your father. Monroe is the real villain in this story, Anastasia. I was a force of nature, an earthquake, a storm. But he was the saboteur who weakened the foundations so the building would fall. He's the one who personally, deliberately betrayed a man who trusted him. Don't let him get away with it again." He took a step closer. "This isn't about my money. This is about his crime. We can expose him. Together. You have the knowledge, the history. I have the resources, the platform. We can give your father's memory the truth." She was silent for a long time, her eyes scanning his, searching for deceit. She was weighing the burning hatred she felt for Gideon against the cold, precise poison she felt for Monroe. Working with Gideon was a bitter pill to swallow, but the alternative, letting Monroe succeed again, building his own career on yet another ruin, was unthinkable. It was a choice between two evils, but only one offered the chance for retribution. "I won't be your employee," she said finally, her voice hard as diamond. "And this will not be about saving your company." "Agreed," Gideon said without hesitation. "I want access to everything, all files related to the Kovac Capital acquisition, all of Monroe's communications, everything." "Done. And when it's over," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "we will create a foundation in my father's name. A real one. Funded by Price Dynamics. An educational trust for students of international law and finance, the kind of honorable people he wished he was in business with." Gideon saw the path she was laying out. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about restoration, rebuilding a legacy not of wealth but of principle. It was a far better goal than his own had ever been. "On my honor," Gideon Price said. A flicker of a new understanding passed between them. They were no longer a billionaire and a waitress. They were two ghosts, haunted by the same man. And they had just formed an alliance. The game was on, and for the first time, Gideon Price wasn't playing for money. He was playing for redemption. The corporate suite Gideon had assigned to Anna was less of an office and more of a command center overlooking the city from the 72nd floor. It was a space of minimalist luxury, all glass steel and muted grey leather, designed to make a person feel on top of the world. For Anna, it was merely a sterile, functional box. She had pushed the expensive designer furniture to the perimeter, creating a wide-open space in the center, where she'd set up a series of monitors and whiteboards. The gilded cage had become her war room, and she commanded it with the quiet intensity of a grandmaster studying a chessboard. Gone was the waitress's severe bun and drab uniform. She now wore simple, sharp business attire that fit her as if it were a second skin. Yet she moved with the same contained energy, the same unnerving stillness. The staff who had first whispered about the CEO's mysterious new translator now watched her with a mixture of fear and profound respect. They saw her walk into boardrooms and dismantle arguments with a few quiet, precise sentences. They saw Gideon Price, a man who listened to no one, hang on her every word. Their nights fell into a grueling rhythm, fueled by endless pots of black coffee and a tense, unspoken alliance. Together, they descended into the digital archives of price dynamics, excavating the 6-year-old files of the Kovac capital acquisition. For Gideon, it was an act of self-flagellation. He watched the data scroll by cold, ruthless memos he had approved, aggressive strategies he had championed, and for the first time he saw them not as triumphs of commerce, but as weapons that had been aimed at a family. He would watch Anna's face, illuminated by the glow of the screen, as she navigated the architecture of her own family's ruin. Her expression remained a mask of neutrality, but he could see the ghost of pain in the tightness of her jaw, or the way her fingers would pause for a fraction of a second over her father's name. "Here," she said, one night, her voice low and steady. She pointed to a section of code in the logs. "This is Monroe's terminal ID from the London office. These data transfers were masked as routine system backups, but they're not. The destination IP address is a ghost server that was wiped an hour after each transfer." The information he fed us, Gideon concluded the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "More than that," Anna murmured, her eyes narrowing. She cross-referenced the dates with market data from the same period. "Look, 2 days before you initiated the short sell, Monroe executed a complex derivative trade through a shell corporation. It was designed to fail, but it was insured through a third party. The trade massively increased Kovac Capital's risk exposure, making it look unstable. It weakened the stock just enough for your play to be a killing blow instead of just a wound. He wasn't just leaking information to you. He was actively sabotaging my father from the inside. He wasn't just a traitor. He was an arsonist." Gideon stared at the screen, a cold fury rising within him. He had believed himself to be the predator, the one in control. In reality, he had been a guided missile aimed by a man who had used Gideon's own ruthless ambition as a weapon for personal gain. "He's doing it again," Gideon said, his voice a low growl. "The final signing with the consortium is in Geneva in 3 days. He's been pushing for a last-minute amendment to the governance clause, something about unrestricted, independent auditing rights. On the surface, it looks like he's promoting transparency." Anna's eyes lit up with a cold, calculating fire. "But it's designed to detonate the deal. Herr Schmidt's entire philosophy is built on internal process and control. An unknown external entity with unrestricted power is his worst nightmare. Madame Dubois would see it as an ceding of sovereignty. He's not trying to add a safeguard, he's planting a bomb." "How do we expose him?" Gideon asked. The question was not that of a boss to a subordinate, but of one strategist to another. A rare, dangerous smile touched Anna's lips. "We don't expose him. We hand him the shovel and let him dig his own grave. He sees me as your translator, an accessory. He sees you as the same blunt instrument you were 6 years ago. He is blinded by his own arrogance. We will use that blindness as our weapon." The plan they formulated was intricate, audacious, and deeply personal. It was a checkmate that had to be delivered not just on a corporate level, but on a human one. 3 days later, the air in the Geneva boardroom was light and celebratory. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the pristine surface of Lake Geneva below. The final documents, bound in rich leather, sat at the center of the vast mahogany table. Robert Monroe was in his element, gliding through the room with a confident smile, shaking hands, his voice a smooth balm of corporate reassurance. He threw a cursory, almost pitying glance at Anna, who sat silently beside Gideon, her hands resting calmly in her lap. To Monroe, she was merely the latest, most exotic piece in Gideon's collection. The meeting began progressing smoothly through the final pleasantries. Then, just as they reached the section on governance, Monroe held up a hand, clearing his throat to command the room's attention. "A final point of order, if I may," he said, his tone oozing reason and caution. "For the sake of our mutual and continued trust, I believe a small addendum is in order. I propose that an independent third-party auditing firm be granted full and unrestricted access to all operational financials on a quarterly basis, a simple measure to ensure absolute transparency." The trap was set. A subtle tension instantly permeated the room. As predicted, Herr Schmidt's genial expression tightened, his posture stiffening. Across the table, Madame Dubois' perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched in skepticism. The celebratory atmosphere curdled. Gideon played his part to perfection, leaning forward with a look of troubled concern. "Robert, is this truly necessary? It feels excessive. It implies a lack of trust we have worked so hard to build." "Not at all," Gideon Monroe countered with a magnanimous wave of his hand. "Think of it as a sign of our strength, our supreme confidence. We are showing the world we have nothing to hide." This was the cue. Before anyone else could object, Anna leaned forward. The movement was slight, but it drew every eye. She turned her head slightly and addressed Herr Schmidt directly in flawless academic German. Her voice was calm and clear, yet it cut through the room's tension like a surgeon's scalpel. She stated that while his proposal had the appearance of transparency, it could in fact undermine their proven internal control processes and lead to crippling bureaucratic delays. Monroe's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but Anna had already turned to Madame Dubois. Her French was as elegant and precise as her German had been resolute. She argued that such a clause would grant an unknown external entity an unprecedented and dangerous level of power, setting a precedent that could haunt all future European joint ventures. Her head then inclined in a slight, respectful bow toward Mr. Tanaka. In formal, nuanced Japanese, she explained that from a cultural perspective, such a demand at this final stage could be perceived as a profound lack of faith in the partner's honor, a grievous offense. Monroe was no longer confused. He was visibly alarmed. His face began to flush as he watched Anna command the room, speaking to each delegation not as a translator, but as a peer. She was building walls around him, brick by brick, in languages he could not understand. "This is highly irregular." He finally snapped, his voice sharp with panic as he turned on Gideon. "Since when does the translator dictate corporate strategy?" Gideon let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke, his voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "Ms. Kovacs is not a translator. She is my senior strategic advisor, and she has a counter-proposal." It was as if a spotlight had been thrown onto Anna. She rose to her feet, and in that moment, any lingering trace of the quiet waitress was burned away. She stood, transformed, imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with intellect and will. "We all agree that transparency is paramount," she began, her English crisp and commanding. "Therefore, instead of an unknown, external auditor, I propose we establish a new internal audit committee. This committee will be comprised of senior members from each partner organization, with its chair rotating on an annual basis. This structure promotes true partnership, not suspicion. It leverages our collective expertise rather than questioning it." It was a masterful stroke of diplomacy. Herr Schmidt nodded in vigorous, open approval. Madame Dubois gave a slow, deliberate smile of assent. Anna paused, letting her solution settle in the room. Then her gaze fell upon Robert Monroe, and her voice dropped, becoming as cold and sharp as ice. "Furthermore," she continued, "to demonstrate our own unwavering commitment to this principle of absolute transparency price dynamics, will now turn over all internal documentation related to a past acquisition, an acquisition where a tragic lack of oversight led to devastating consequences. I am speaking of the hostile takeover of Kovac Capital 6 years ago. The name landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Monroe went white, a strangled sound catching in his throat. Anna held his terrified gaze and began her final assault. She turned to Madame Dubois, speaking in cutting French. An acquisition made possible only by the willing betrayal of a senior Kovac executive, a man named Robert Monroe, who methodically sabotaged his own company for personal profit. She pivoted to Herr Schmidt, her German a clinical indictment. A man who is at this very moment deploying the same tactics of mistrust and sabotage to undermine this venture and everyone in this room. Finally, she looked straight at a stunned Sheikh al-Hamad and spoke in clear, formal Arabic, delivering a proverb as old as the desert itself. A man who betrays his master's trust once will always betray it. His honor is lost. With a final deliberate movement, she placed a small, sleek data stick on the polished table. "This contains the irrefutable proof," she stated to the room at large. "Encrypted communications, offshore financial records of his payoffs, and the code he used to sabotage his own bank systems. It proves a pattern of behavior, a pattern of betrayal he was repeating today." The silence that followed was profound and crushing. Robert Monroe was utterly broken. He stood there exposed and metaphorically naked before the titans of industry he had sought to manipulate. He looked from the horrified, disgusted faces of the partners to the unforgiving, steel-hard gaze of Gideon Price. But the eyes he could not bring himself to meet were Anna's. In them he saw not just the woman who had destroyed him, but the ghost of Dmitry Kovac, the memory of a family he had shattered, and the face of an unavoidable righteous justice. Without another word, he turned, stumbling like a man in a trance, and walked out of the room, leaving his career, his reputation, and his future in ruins behind him. The deal was signed shortly thereafter, but the signing itself was an afterthought. The real event had already concluded. As the partners prepared to depart, Herr Schmidt gave Anna a deep, respectful nod. Madame Dubois took her hand warmly, but the most significant moment came when they were alone. Gideon looked at the woman who had saved his deal, exposed his enemy, and forced him to confront the man he used to be. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet and heavy with meaning. "Anastasia." He used her real name for the first time, and in doing so, acknowledged not the ghost he had helped create, but the formidable woman who had risen from the ashes. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a mistaken identity. It was a story about the true meaning of value. Gideon Price learned that a person's worth isn't printed on a degree or a bank statement, but is forged in the fires of adversity and measured by their character. Anna Kovac, or rather Anastasia Kovac, reminded the world that intelligence and resilience are the great equalizers capable of shattering any glass ceiling and any prejudice. She didn't just get her revenge, she rebuilt a legacy, transforming the pain of her past into a foundation for a better future, not just for herself, but for others. Their story is a powerful testament to the hidden giants who walk among us, the quiet ones, the underestimated, the invisible. It urges us to look beyond the uniform, beyond the job title, and to see the person within. If this story moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will inspire and make you think. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.